is a playful, even childish holiday. It's kind of like Halloween. The story is retold, and I want to tell it to you today as a fairy tale. Now, the villain of the piece is Haman. And when the story is told in Jewish circles, they boo and kiss and stomp their feet and rattle noisemakers to try to obliterate his name whenever it's mentioned. So this story is going to call for some congregational participation. Whenever you hear the phrase, Prime Minister Haman, you should boo. Okay. That's your cue. Let's practice that. I say, Prime Minister. Okay, number 7. This story begins, as most good fairy tales do, with once upon a time in the kingdom of Persia, which was ruled over at that point by a king named, and I'm always mucking up this name, Ahasuerus. Remember that name, because I'm not going to say it again. Now, he was not the brightest star in the firmament, but he was the king, and he loved to give long banquets. And once when he had given a banquet for 7 days, when all had eaten their fill and probably drunk a little bit more than was good for them, he started boasting about the beauty of his queen. "Show us," said his guests. So he sent for the queen, and Queen Vashti, a blessedly short name, was reluctant to show her beauty in front of the king's drunken guests. So she refused to come. Well, the king was outraged. And all of his ministers, including his prime minister, said to him, "You should depose her. Get rid of her." They were afraid that if she defied the king, what would their own lives do? So he threw her out, banished her from the kingdom, and then he got lonely. So his ministers, led by his prime minister, said to him, "Gather all the beautiful young women of your kingdom and choose your new queen from amongst them." So he did that. And living in the city at the time was a young Jewish woman named Esther, who had been raised by her cousin Mordecai. Now, she was exceedingly beautiful, and so she was summoned to the palace with the others. Mordecai warned her not to tell anybody that she was a Jew, but to reassure her, said that he would wait at the palace gates every day for word of her. So Esther went off to the palace, and when her turn came to go before the king, he did think that she was the hottest thing going. So she became the new queen of Persia. Meanwhile, Mordecai was waiting and worrying by the palace gates. And one day, the prime minister walked by. Now, Haman had persuaded the king, who was not perhaps the sharpest arrow in the quiver, to order everyone in his kingdom to bow down to him. But when Haman walked past Mordecai, Mordecai didn't bow down. Why not? Mordecai responded, "I'm a Jew, and I bow before no man." So Haman went to the king that very night and said, "Your Majesty, there are scattered throughout your kingdom a people who only obey their own laws and do not obey yours. You should get rid of them." And the king, who was not the sharpest reed in the swamp, said, "Do with them as you win. So Haman went home and sent a letter to all the princes and governors of the kingdom, saying, on the 13th day of the 12th month, all Jews, young and old, men, women, and children, must be killed. Their goods should be confiscated and sent, oddly enough, to me. Well, when the Jews of Persia heard this, they put on sackcloth and ashes and wept and wailed. And Mordecai at the palace gates did the same, and sent a message to Esther saying, you must go to the king. Tell him that you are a Jew and plead for your own life and the lives of your people. But Esther responded, I dare not go. If anyone goes into the king's presence unsummoned, they die. Only if he raises his scepter to save their lives may they live. And the king has not sent for me for 30 days. Mordecai responded, don't think that your position in the palace will protect you. Who knows, perhaps it was just for such a moment as this that you became the queen. So Esther thought, and she sent a message back to Mordecai, tell all the Jews of the city to fast for me for 3 days and 3 nights, and I and my maids will do so as well. And at the end of 3 days I shall go to the king, although I have not been summoned, and although I may die. And if I perish, I perish. On the 3rd day, she put on her royal robes and went and stood at the doorway of the king's inner court. And the king saw that someone was standing there unsummoned, and at first he was angry, but then he saw it was Esther, and he raised his scepter to save her life. She came into the court, touched the scepter, and said, Your Majesty, if I have ever found favor with you, I beg that you will spare the lives of me and of the Jews, for Haman has ordered the death of all Jews. The king remembered the conversation that he'd had with Haman, but he loved Esther, so he rescinded Haman's order. The Prime Minister Haman heard of this and was afraid that he was falling from favor with the king. So, in an ill-advised kind of move, one cannot help but think, he went to Esther's chambers to plead for forgiveness and for her intervention with the king on his behalf. So ardent was his desire that she do this, that he flung himself upon her. And at that moment, the king, not perhaps the brightest candle in the menorah, into the room and saw Haman clinging to the queen. Well, he was overcome with jealousy, and he had Haman hung. Wow. Moreover, Mordecai was brought into the palace to be his new prime minister instead. And when the Jews of Persia heard this, they rejoiced and celebrated. And they all lived happily ever after. Except, of course, for the ex-prime minister. You know, when I was a child, I loved the book of Esther. It was like a fairy tale. It was so romantic. A beautiful but modest young orphan plucked from obscurity, wins a king's love, becomes queen of an exotic land, saves her people. It was like Disney from the Bible. What girl could possibly ask for more? You know, but as an adult, Was being the chosen one of a king what she had in mind for her life? And how precarious that exalted position was. Others in the harem, and it was a harem, might conspire against her, probably did. Her influence could wane. The king, we've heard, has not sent for her to comfort him for a month. Esther could have thought her position was very vulnerable and that she was no longer in favor, and queens had, after all, been deposed before her. The king had absolute control over her, and she was at his mercy. Still, in the end, she spoke out against the most powerful man in the country after the king, claiming her voice and her hidden identity as a Jew in order to protect those who were even more vulnerable than she, finding common cause with those who were not as safe or as privileged. When you're on the margins, it can feel dangerous to speak. When I call injustice, attention to injustice, perhaps it's going to be dismissed because I'm just a soggy woman. Isn't it safer for an African American, a single mother, a gay, lesbian, or transgendered person, an unemployed or undocumented worker? Isn't it safer to just keep quiet? But that safety can be a prison like Esther's harem, which isolates me from everyone else, both those who share my particular oppression and those whose circumstances are different from mine. This last week at Drew, we had the opportunity to hear Father Roy Bourgeois, a Catholic Maryknoll priest and the founder of the School of the Americas Watch. And he talked about his own conversion. Early in his career as a Maryknoller, he was sent to Bolivia, where he chose to live in a parish on the outskirts of La Paz. There the poor taught him, he said, the meaning of solidarity, to make another struggle for justice, peace, and equality your own struggle. And Esther, even in the fairy tale, urges us to do the same. Even in the midst of our own oppression, it's crucial to find our voice, to claim our own power, however limited we may feel that power is. We are called, by Esther's example, to align ourselves with those whose welfare and dignity is threatened by our society, in Morristown, in our country, and in our world, to walk and speak in solidarity with all those who are on the margins.